Welcome to the Zeckelman Holocaust Center. My name is Katie Chaka-Parks, and I'm Manager of Adult Education, and I would like to welcome everyone this evening to our program, Never Again, Germans and Genocide After the Holocaust. On behalf of the center, I would like to acknowledge and thank our community partners at Wayne State University, the Cohen-Haddo Center for Judaic Studies, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and the Department of History. I would also like to thank our program's supporters, Robin and Leo Eisenberg, Frank and Mark Newman, Sandy Schreier, Renee and David Silbert, and Sarah Geyer and Scott Strauss. In addition, we of course want to thank a very special thank you to our museum members and our donors. Your generosity is what allows us to have these programs at no charge, and we're very grateful for such support. At the HC, we believe that we all have a moral responsibility to use the lessons learned from the Holocaust to recognize the warning signs of genocide today. We want our visitors, our viewers, our community to feel empowered to take action whenever they witness any type of hatred or injustice. It is not enough to only remember the past, but we must choose to stand up for those that are vulnerable to mass atrocities in our world today. And with that, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing tonight's speaker, Dr. Andrew Port. Andrew is an award-winning scholar and author of several books about modern Germany, genocide, and Holocaust memory. A graduate of Yale and Harvard, Dr. Port is a professor of history at Wayne State University and is frequently invited to lecture throughout North America and Europe. Dr. Port is also the former editor of the flagship journal Central European History and has won numerous prizes and fellowships, including his award for distinguished scholarship in German and European studies. Andrew is clearly a very important scholar in the field of history, and we are very lucky to have him within our local community here in Michigan. Now, beyond his amazing scholarship, Andrew has also rigorously trained a generation of historians to think deeply about historical matters and their implications on our world today. And I am very personally lucky to say that he's my doctoral advisor. So, without further ado, I would like to please welcome my mentor, colleague, and friend, Dr. Andrew Port.
Is it up? Here we go. Okay, good. Okay, can you all hear me? Is it loud enough? Okay. Katie, thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's been wonderful having you as a student. I'm so glad you're working here. I look forward to your book in the near future. And how many of you were here for Katie's talk? A few, yeah, that was awesome. Wonderful. All right. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'll begin by talking a bit about the book. That'll be primarily what I'll do, and then if we have some time, I'll read some excerpts from it so you can get a bit of a taste of it. Let me set the scene. Sarajevo, several months after the signing of the Dayton Peace Accords that ended the war in Bosnia. Departing Serb forces in a final act of vengeful spite are setting aflame any structure still standing after their 4-year-long siege of the Bosnian capital. Dr. Rupert Neudeck spends the day with his son Marcel in a residential section of the city, breaking down doors and rushing into burning buildings to save the lives of elderly Muslims. The winter of 1996 is a cold one, and Dr. Neudeck is taking yet another holiday with his immediate family in an active war zone. It's his third time here, or there, in Sarajevo since news first broke about genocidal ethnic cleansing, mass rapes, and the setting up of concentration camps in the Balkans. That evening, the renowned German journalist and humanitarian sits quietly in a Bosnian friend's apartment reading, out of necessity by candlelight, a book about the Wehrmacht's occupation of Poland a half-century earlier. Waking to the sound of explosions early the next day, he looks out the window at all the destruction in the street below. That, he later recalls, was precisely how I imagined early mornings in the Warsaw Ghetto. There are olfactory reminders of the past as well. The road that, quote, smelled of genocide near Srebrenica, for instance, or the, quote, treacly foul stench of decaying corpses in Kigali. Yes, Rupert Neudeck had also been in Rwanda during the genocidal rampage of 1994, and that was no coincidence. Over the previous decade and a half, he had frequently been among the first German volunteers to arrive in trouble spots across the globe, organizing dozens of humanitarian missions from Southeast Asia to Southeast Europe. Most of this work was done on the side as a shoestring operation of sorts during vacation or on nights and weekends with his wife, Crystal, in their modest townhouse on the outskirts of Cologne. That was where I visited Rupert Neudeck to find out why he had chosen to go to places like Mogadishu instead of Mallorca, a preferred vacation spot for most middle-class Germans. Neudeck, go back to this slide, Neudeck cut a dashing figure with a gaunt, weathered face and a neatly trimmed white beard. He had the air of a sea captain, though he was often mistaken for a medical doctor, an understandable error given all the medical assistance he had brought to Asia and Africa over the years. He was, in fact, a doctor of philosophy. Born in Danzig on the eve of World War II, Neudeck fled westward with his mother and younger siblings away from the Red Army in the waning months of the war. He studied law as a young man and served as a Jesuit novice, but then decided to change course and write a doctoral thesis on the political ethics of Sartre and Camus. After completing his degree, Neudeck took a different career path once again, beginning work in 1977 as a journalist and editor at West Germany's premier public radio station. He and his wife, he later told me, were leading a, quote, perfectly bourgeois life at the time. And I guess you get a bit of a sense of that from that photo. That all changed in February 1979 during a trip he took to Paris to collect material for a new book he planned to write on Sartre. And it was there that Neudeck met with the renowned French philosopher André Glucksmann, whom you see here. And Glucksmann was the first to speak with him at length about the dire situation of the so-called boat people in Southeast Asia. Their plight had just broken as a major news story several months earlier. Que faites-vous? What are you doing? Glucksmann greeted Neudeck in the cafe where they met. What was he personally going to do about the refugees? Neudeck had similarly memorable meetings with Sartre himself and with Bernard Kouchner. Kouchner, of course, the future French foreign minister who had founded Doctors Without Borders in 1971. So this here is Glucksmann, of course. Whether that's the same cafe that he met Neudeck in, I don't know. This is Bernard Kouchner here on this ship that he had hired to rescue boat people. Interestingly enough, both of them were European Jews. Both of them had lost many family members during the Holocaust. Well, inspired by these three men, Neudeck returned to Germany, intent on doing his part to help refugees from the region who were stranded and dying on the high seas. And that was a decision that had a great deal to do with Neudeck's own personal history. On January 30th, 1945, during their flight from Danzig, he and his family arrived in the Baltic port city of Gotenhafen, where they saw a large cruise ship in the harbor, the Wilhelm Gustloff. Originally built in the mid-1930s for the Nazi leisure movement, Strength Through Joy, or Kraft durch Freude, the ship was now being used to evacuate German officials, civilians, and refugees from the advancing Soviet army. Neudek's mother did not have tickets for the Gustloff. She would not have taken a, quote, luxury ship for Nazi bigwigs anyway, he later insisted, and they wound up on board a coal steamer instead. That was our savior, he told me. Later that day, a Soviet submarine sank the Gustloff, and thousands of its passengers drowned in the freezing waters of the Baltic. The news quickly reached him and his family, and horrific images of the disaster left an indelible impression on the 5-year-old. And this was why Neudek believed death by drowning became such an important archetype in his life and a major motivation for his later relief efforts. Thanks to a flood of private donations, Neudek was able to charter and outfit a decommissioned Dutch freighter, the Cap aan Amour, which you see here on the right. By the summer of 1982, the ship had rescued almost 10,000 boat people, most of whom were later allowed to seek refuge in the Federal Republic. The group became best known at the time for this perilous undertaking, but its activities were not limited to saving the lives of those fleeing by sea. Neudek also sent teams of German doctors and nurses to the Thai-Cambodian border to assist Cambodian refugees who had just survived the Khmer Rouge genocide. Here is Neudek hoisting a sign at this camp, and here he is with some young girls, some of the young boat people that he and his volunteers had helped to save. Their work in the refugee camps relied on the generous support of private citizens and German celebrities, including the Nobel Prize-winning novelist Heinrich Böll. Equally essential was the engagement of hundreds of West Germans who volunteered for stints of 4 to 8 weeks. And that included one nurse from Bonn, the city of Bonn, who decided to volunteer instead of taking a ski vacation that year, and who, she later explained, worked for 5 weeks, quote, under the most primitive conditions. Those are her words. To be effective, Neudek believed volunteers had to live together with the people, without any showers or other niceties. Quote, experiencing hardship and physically sharing their everyday reality is crucial for aid work. One detects here, in a sense, the Christian impulse behind this former Jesuit novice's activities, and perhaps a scholarly interest in existential philosophy as well. A childhood trauma, a Catholic upbringing, and a fortuitous visit to Paris in the winter of 1979. These were the 3 main influences that first spurred Rupert Neudek into action. And when I sat with him decades later in a living room filled to the brim with foreign art and other artifacts he had collected from abroad over the years, the conversation eventually turned to why his volunteers did what they did. They had endless motivations, he surmised, but there was most certainly a very great collective willingness on the part of his fellow Germans to do, quote, more for humanitarian issues than all other European nationalities. And that most certainly has to do with the past. But which past exactly? His own motivation, he readily acknowledged, had been his traumatic experiences as a child refugee. But what about the suffering the Germans had caused, and not the suffering they had earlier experienced themselves? Nazi crimes against humanity, and the Jews in particular, had played a, quote, powerful role, he believed, adding that his organization's activities were a, quote, semi-conscious attempt to compensate somehow for this past, to portray Germany, quote, a little bit differently in the world. And when it came to humanitarian actions, German volunteers always did more than their Europeans, he insisted, because they didn't want to be surpassed in their efforts. This was, after all, one area where they were, quote, allowed to be on top of the world. Several weeks after meeting with Rupert Neudek, I spoke with Helmut Schmidt about his government's response to the Cambodian genocide. The former West German chancellor had come under attack in the late 1970s for not doing enough to help refugees in Indochina. What happened tens of thousands of miles away in Southeast Asia did not threaten West Germany in any way, he bluntly told me, and the genocide in Cambodia, quote, didn't concern us. Almost all Asian countries committed acts that, quote, violated morality, he rather huffily added, but this was simply not, quote, our affair. He used an interesting German expression. He said this was not unser Bier, this was our beer. The Federal Republic's vital interests came before moral and humanitarian considerations, he continued, and in the realm of foreign affairs, those interests consisted almost exclusively of the existential threat posed by Soviet nuclear weapons stationed in Eastern Europe. Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher, who you see here on the right, had a similar take at the time. Annoyed by repeated requests for information about the Cambodian genocide, he wanted to know why some West German politicians were placing, quote, so much value on this issue anyway. Whatever reservations the two men may have had, their country would take in almost 14,000 refugees from Indochina by the spring of 1980, and here are some of them arriving at the airport in Frankfurt. That was the highest number among Western nations without any special ties to the region, such as the United States and France. Now, by way of explanation for why they did this, why they took in so many, West German officials pointed to their own country's bitter experiences involving mass flight and expulsion in the 1940s and the 1950s. Genscher himself had fled communist East Germany as a young man. But as the number of refugees skyrocketed worldwide, beginning in the late 1970s, and with it the number of people applying for asylum in the Federal Republic, the initial willingness to welcome those poor souls fleeing war-torn regions quickly gave rise to angry resentment about foreign frauds supposedly taking advantage of German generosity. Two contrasting sets of responses then to one of the world's most horrific genocides since the systematic murder of the European Jews in the 1940s. Copious concern and bountiful largesse, apparent indifference and acrimonious backlash, responses that prefigure in many ways developments in today's Federal Republic. Since 2015, the xenophobic far right has enjoyed a political resurgence there in the wake of Chancellor Angela Merkel's controversial decision to welcome more than 1 million refugees from Africa and the Middle East. Both developments drew global attention to Germany, but neither the Chancellor's largesse nor the backlash it's since brought in its wake should have been a surprise. At least not to those familiar with the story of what Germans have talked about and done in response to genocide and other mass suffering in foreign lands since 1945. There are, as you all know, few countries more haunted by the darker aspects of their recent history than Germany. 75 years after the end of World War II, the barbaric crimes committed by the Nazis continue to cast a long shadow at home and abroad, coloring perceptions and self-perceptions of the country and its people. Yet the story of how Germans managed to put their violent, genocidal past behind them in practice and create a stable and prosperous democracy reluctant to use force and committed to the defense of human rights, that is an equally important and gripping tale. If the driving question about the years prior to 1945 had long been a disheartening one, where did Germany go wrong? The period since the war, since 1945, presents, I think, a different puzzle. How and why did Germany go right? My book, Never Again, tackles these questions in a roundabout way, using German responses to mass murder in other lands to understand how the weight of the past shaped beliefs and influenced actual behavior, in the post-war present. And I consciously chose this indirect approach, right, German reactions to foreign genocides, because I hope to present a less stilted picture of German memory work. Now, there are many theories about, abstract theories, many of them, about the nature and significance of collective memory. But to my mind, its true importance lies in its consequences, in its tangible effects on actual attitudes and actions. And that is why I focus in my book less on solemn statements by high-level officials, the usual approach to German Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or coming to terms with the past, and instead more on the concrete acts that came in response to reports of foreign genocides decades after the so-called final solution. Now, to get at these issues, I specifically look at German responses to the three infamous genocides that took place in Cambodia, Bosnia, and Rwanda from the mid-1970s to the mid-1990s. That choice is an important one because it lays bare, I think, evolving reactions to mass murder during a period of drastic change, from the height of the Cold War, when two German states still existed, to the period following unification, from a time when few Germans showed much interest in the Holocaust, to one when few topics generated as much public attention as the genocide of the European Jews. The precise timing of these genocides, as I just suggested, is significant. By chance, a conspicuous spike in interest about the fate of the European Jews coincided with the genocide in Cambodia. In fact, the Khmer Rouge were driven from power the very month the American miniseries Holocaust aired on West German television in January 1979. That was a sensational media event in West Germany. It was one that initiated a public fixation on the final solution at precisely the point in time when first-hand details about the carnage in Cambodia began to emerge. And it fundamentally influenced German responses to the crimes of the Khmer Rouge. In turn, and I think this is just as interesting, it affected how Germans spoke and thought about their own past. And that became especially clear during the famous, or better said, infamous historians' quarrel, Historikerstreit, the historians' quarrel of the mid-1980s. For those of you unfamiliar, that was a fierce public debate between German progressives and conservatives carried out in the major newspapers and magazines about the uniqueness of what now increasingly became known as the Holocaust. There are other good reasons why I start my book in the 1970s. That was the decade when global interest in human rights reemerged. It was also when the worldwide flow of refugees reached unprecedented proportions, a development that had a major impact on German responses to foreign genocide. It stimulated humanitarians' efforts to relieve mass suffering abroad, as I already mentioned, but it also stoked fears about letting in too many foreigners, especially supposedly bogus ones, coming to Germany for purely venal reasons. Few issues have enlivened and politicized public debate of late as much as immigration, and as we Americans are well aware, not just in the Federal Republic. My book draws attention to two contradictory impulses then, since the 1970s. Rampant fear, anger, and resentment about overburdening and, quote, excessive foreignization. The Germans have one of those long words for that, Überfremdung, excessive foreignization. So rampant fear, anger, and resentment about overburdening on the one hand, and a widespread desire, even compulsion for some, because of Germany's past, to help the less fortunate. A look at German reactions to genocide during the first half of the 1990s takes our story into the period after the Cold War, and thus into a much different geopolitical context. Germany's unexpected unification in 1990 not only marked the end of 4 decades of division, but also transformed the country's international position. The restoration of full sovereignty meant that the country now had greater freedom for maneuver, as well as greater international responsibilities, and its responses to the twin genocides in Bosnia and Rwanda show how this dramatically reconfigured the country's foreign policy, as well as its relationship with a now more distant past. The Federal Republic's changed standing in the world gave rise to a great deal of anguish and hand-wringing at the time. Would unified Germany remain a quote-unquote tamed power, or would it revert to its just dangerous and destructive ways of yore? Had the country truly learned the lessons of its history? The question of what those lessons even were became a great source of vexed debate in the shadow of genocidal atrocities in the Balkans, where unified Germany faced its most significant challenge abroad since unification: whether to participate in joint international military efforts aimed at stopping genocide and other human rights abuses on foreign soil. That confronted Germans with difficult choices that threw into disarray the old post-war consensus on foreign policy and the non-use of force. Even renowned pacifists like Joschka Fischer, a former student radical and future foreign minister of Germany, came down on the side of what became known as humanitarian intervention. I'm going to go off script here for a second. Just out of curiosity, how many of you know who Joschka Fischer is? How many of you have heard that name before? Okay, just a few of you. So Joschka Fischer is an interesting character. He was involved in the student protest movement, not in the late 60s. He was a little too young for that, but in the early 1970s. When he became, I'm getting ahead of myself, but he later entered politics. He became the environmental party, the Green Party's kind of star after Petra Kelly was murdered in the early 1990s. He had a very strange development. This was a guy who in the early 70s, there are photos of him beating up policemen, knocking them off of motorcycles and beating them up. And then you fast forward 2 decades and he started wearing Armani suits and running in marathons and very similar to Bernard Kouchner in France, right? A former radical who also, like Fischer, embraced this humanitarian intervention. Why do I mention all of this? Well, at the risk of name dropping, I talked about doing an interview with Neudeck and Helmut Schmidt. One person I really wanted to interview for this book was Joschka Fischer. And I must have written to him at least 20 emails, also to his personal secretary. He is no longer in politics. He now has a consulting firm, which, of course, all former student radicals open at some point. And he didn't respond to any of them. Okay. 2 or 3 weeks ago now, I flew to Germany. It was my first time there in 7 years. And I get there on a Sunday morning. That afternoon, a friend takes me to an ATM to pick up some money. And I'm walking into this little room they have inside with the ATM machines. And I notice an elderly gentleman walking behind me. So I did something pretty untypical for Berlin. I held the door for him and I said, "Please, come." And I looked, and who was it? And I immediately, the first thing I said was, "Herr Fischer?" I said, "I'm Andrew Port." No reaction. I said, I wrote you and your assistant, Frau Tusek, 20 times, no response. And he said, "Uh-huh." So I just wrote a book about German responses to genocide. You play a very prominent role in it. Not a word, just standing there. So then I finally said, "Well, look, I'd really like to give you a copy of it." if you'd like. And he goes like this. So he gets his money, I get my money. He walks out, he turns to me, says, have a nice rest of your day. And there's a woman standing there at the other ATM, and I went up to her, I said, do you know who that was? And she said, yeah, of course I do. And I told her the whole story, and I mentioned the fact, I offered him the book and he didn't want it. And she said, well, I'll tell you what, if he doesn't want the book, you can send me a copy. All right. My initial interest in German responses to foreign genocide came in the summer of 1992, when I first heard reports that Serbs had set up concentration camps in Bosnia. I was living in Germany at the time, and I vividly recall television images of emaciated men with shaved heads standing behind barbed wire. The images resonated for obvious reasons, and I distinctly recall thinking that this could not be true, that there could not be concentration camps in Europe in 1992. I also recall a great deal of skepticism in Germany as well, as policymakers and public figures and the media struggled to come up with a proper response. Never again Auschwitz or never again war. Those two slogans encapsulated the harrowing dilemma that many Germans faced after learning about the genocidal atrocities taking place in Bosnia. Should their country, because of its past, stand by and do nothing in response to reports of yet another genocide, this time only a day's drive from Berlin, or should they participate in international interventions intended to stop the mass slaughter by force? The story of how Germans confronted their past and the concrete consequences that had in response to mass atrocities abroad, it's a highly relevant story that is, I'd argue, almost as worthy of our interest as the darker topics in modern German history. Now, the focus on Nazism and the Holocaust is understandable, of course. After all, who writes or reads novels about happy couples? But the attention my book devotes to the admirable and often uplifting actions of Germans from all walks of life offers other countries with difficult pasts, including the United States, a master class in coming to terms with the more sinister aspects of their own history, especially at a moment when many seem to fear that the United States might go the way Germany did in the 1930s. How many of you here are familiar with the book by Susan Neiman, Learning from the Germans? It's just a couple of you. I saw it. It's also in the bookstore next door to us here. That is essentially the argument of her book, that Americans can learn from Germans how to deal with this more difficult aspect of their past. As you'll see in the rest of my talk this evening, I go in a somewhat different direction. But anyway, looking to the Germans for inspiration reinforces a widespread tendency to see post-war Western Germany as a success story. Now, there are good reasons for questioning that simple but uplifting narrative, which downplays the less sanguine aspects of Germany's post-war history. Widespread racism, sexism, wealth differentials, environmental degradation, et cetera, et cetera. Still, even with those caveats in mind, and even when not measured against the horrible foil of Nazi Germany, the Federal Republic was indeed a success story, a place where Germans effectively put their violent, once genocidal past behind them. Their response to genocides in foreign lands are an untold aspect of that story. Now, it is true that those responses did not do much to prevent genocide. They were more reactive than active, even when it was taking place in their own backyard in the Balkans. And despite their obligations as an early signatory of the 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. But my book does not take a normative or prescriptive approach. It's not a j'accuse Germans for what they should have done in the face of genocide. Some of you may have read the book by Samantha Power, A Problem from Hell. Samantha Power, who was President Obama's ambassador to the UN. Just out of curiosity, have any of you read that or are familiar with the book, A Problem from Hell? Right. Well, that's what she does. It's really an indictment of the United States for not having done more to prevent genocide elsewhere in the world. My book doesn't do that. It explores instead the parameters of the possible for post-war Germany, given the weight of its past and its own international position before and after 1989. Hardly anyone, least of all the Germans themselves, would have wished or expected East or West Germany to take military action abroad. That would change dramatically after unification. And that transformation, along with the stormy domestic debates unleashed by the decision to intervene militarily in Bosnia, those are central themes of my book. And as some of you are probably thinking, they're, of course, also themes that are highly relevant today, given the ongoing war in Ukraine. Now, this is an important point, right, that no one expected Germans to take military action abroad, because I think it moves the conversation beyond moralistic condemnations of an action, beyond the writing of history as quote-unquote politics by other means. For most countries, grand actions involving military force are extremely difficult or simply not possible. And that's why I focus instead on what German officials and citizens could and did do short of sending combat troops, providing various forms of humanitarian assistance, for example, welcoming large numbers of refugees to Germany, exerting diplomatic pressure behind the scenes, enforcing economic sanctions. Reports of mass atrocities goaded Germans into action, in short. And what they did went far beyond high-sounding speeches meant to abjure or atone for past atrocities. And that's significant because it reveals a great deal about German values, mentalities, and lessons learned after 1945. Again, lessons that should be of interest to Americans searching for effective ways to reckon with the more sordid aspects of their own country's past. Now, what has struck me repeatedly about German reactions to foreign genocide is that the legacy and lessons of the Third Reich and the Holocaust were not at all clear-cut. The difficult choice between never again Auschwitz and never again war captures just how ambivalent the burden of history could be. In fact, as my book shows again and again, Germany's violent past could be and was used to draw diametrically opposed conclusions about the proper response to reports of foreign genocide. Those who tended to see Germany's hands tied because of its history, who spoke passionately of a, quote, duty to nonviolence because of Nazi atrocities, they met with equally heartfelt counter-arguments by those who pointed to their country's past as an injunction to act. Quote, we have a political and moral duty to assist precisely in light of our history. This is something Foreign Minister Klaus Kinkel told colleagues in June 1995, just 2 weeks before the genocidal massacre at Srebrenica. He continued, it was, after all, the Allies who, using military force, by the way, freed us from the Nazi dictatorship. If the Third Reich has taught anything, it is perhaps that there are no easy answers to these debates. But my book draws attention to something just as important. The mass suffering caused by Germans was not necessarily the past that mattered most. As Rupert Neudeck's story teaches us, the fellow I began this talk with, the suffering the Germans experienced themselves, their profound sense of victimhood, could be equally motivational. And so could perceptions of political and even economic self-interest. In fact, my book shows how these debates about proper responses to genocide were used over and over to score points against domestic political rivals, with progressives accusing conservatives of supporting humanitarian military interventions in hopes of one day restoring Germany's status as a Großmacht, or great power. Those on the right responded in kind, asking why the left had remained so silent as Cambodian communists butchered millions in the 1970s. What these debates also show is that most conservatives confronted and took responsibility for Germany's past as seriously as their opponents on the left. And that's an important and often overlooked legacy of the political upheavals of the late 1960s, when Nazi crimes became, for almost all Germans, regardless of political outlook, the measure of all things evil. The willingness of conservative Germans to countenance their country's difficult past and draw important lessons from it distinguishes them from many, not all, but many of their counterparts in the United States, who seem disinclined to confront, much less take responsibility for, the history and legacy of American racism, but should also serve as a sign of encouragement that such efforts need not be politically exclusive or one-sided, nor should remorse. There is perhaps another important lesson here for an American audience, and I'll end with this: what to avoid when confronting the past. After 2 decades of deafening silence about the Holocaust, the pendulum swung in the opposite direction beginning in the late 1960s, producing an almost obsessive public preoccupation with the dark side of Germany's past. That eventually produced an angry backlash, even on the part of those who can in no way be considered apologists for the Third Reich. I refer to Germans, even on the left, who complain that the political and moralistic use of negative memories about the Nazi past has been used as a high-handed moral cudgel against political enemies. Now, my book shows how those very disputes dominated public discussion about genocide abroad, fueling accusations that foreign atrocities were being used to somehow relativize Germany's own earlier crimes. And this played out in the very way that language was used. Heated debates about the appropriateness of referring to Serb prison compounds in Bosnia as concentration camps was just one example of this, one that had eerie reverberations in recent debates in the United States about the use of that charged term to describe holding facilities for immigrants on our southern border. The point is, and again, this is where I part from Susan Nyman, the point is that Americans can indeed learn from the Germans about confronting their own checkered past. But those lessons are ambivalent. The need to achieve a balance between too little and too much, to strike a proper tone that does not give rise to nasty recriminations and indignant backlash, that is perhaps the most important lesson the Germans can offer us. Thank you so much for your attention.
All right, well, everyone, I think we can give Dr. Andrew Port another round of applause for that wonderful program. And before we open up questions to the rest of the audience, I'm sure that you have many. We'll give you a second to think, because for those of you that have seen the book, that have seen the postcard for the program this evening, you may have been drawn to the title or the cover art in the book. So we'll start with one question. Could you explain a little bit how you picked this cover art, what it means? Because, of course, you can read it in multiple ways. So if you could talk a little bit about that, please.
Well, I didn't pick it. I received an email from my editor saying, take a deep breath when you see this. She said she needed about a day of looking at it to get used to it. I opened it up. I liked it right away. It just struck me right away. It was designed by a fellow from Detroit, what do you call them? Graphic designer, thank you. I used to speak English fluently. A graphic designer who now lives in Evanston, Illinois, but he was chosen. So my standard response is why people want to know why the words crossed out, and my editor insisted that I reduce the manuscript by about 75,000 words, which I did, and those, no, I'm kidding. She explained to me, it's actually quite interesting. So it's the colors of the German flag, right? The gold, the red, and the black. The background gives a sense of concrete, which of course alludes to the Berlin Wall. It also alludes to what I focus on so much in my book, which is the concrete responses to this, but it's to these horrible genocides. But the crossing out, she wrote to me that is supposed to represent anger at the fact that this has been this goal, this idea of never again should such crimes happen. But of course, horrible mass atrocities continue to happen again and again. And then, of course, you're left with Germans after the Holocaust, right, with the cross out, and that looks interesting as well. So that's the story behind the cover. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we're going to open up questions now to our audience. We have two people walking around with a microphone. If you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand, and they're going to come right over to you. So any questions?
Hi, I'm not sure exactly how to ask this, but I was wondering how you felt about reparations for blacks in comparison to the genocide. And
I suppose my initial inclination is to say, well, that's not really on topic, but of course it is based on some of the things I said in it. Well, I mean, you're asking my personal opinion, so I'll tell you. I certainly admire the sentiment. I don't know if it's a particularly practical one. I think clearly, something needs to be done. Affirmative action no longer exists. For whatever that was supposed to achieve, obviously we've made great progress, but not as much as we in America had hoped to make. So reparations, I don't know if that's the right answer, but I certainly appreciate the sentiment behind it. And I just wanted to add something. When I was writing my talk and delivering it, I sometimes worry that people might think I'm collapsing distinctions, and I really don't think I am. I'm not saying that awful atrocities in other countries are in some way equal to what happened in Germany and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union during the war, but this idea of somehow learning how to confront a difficult past in a more effective way. The Germans have dealt with that, I think, quite effectively. And that's why when I say that, we can take lessons from them also, again, in what not to do, right? The nasty recriminations, the finger pointing, the moralism is something I would, encourage us to keep in mind as well.
Right. So about the crossing out of never again, first of all, the term never again, I take to mean, and I think it's more widely understood to mean never again the Holocaust. And that's part of the work of museums, centers such as this. And I'm guessing that you would, and when I saw that it was crossed out, I assumed that your argument would be that Germans have rejected the idea of never again the Holocaust. And I'm not sure, based on your talk, you would agree with that interpretation. But I think that might be supported from a couple things. One, the reaction you got from Helmut Kohl, that's not our beer, in reference to the Khmer atrocities. Two, I forget, but Joschka Fischer's response, there was another one even, and within the context today of German tanks once again rolling into Ukraine for the third time, in a century. Not, in my personal opinion, that is extremely foreboding considering the results of the first two times. So to me, it seems more appropriate in terms of the German government, at least, in the post-war, that never again should apply to German politics since World War II to reject that policy of never again the Holocaust. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So this idea of never again, if I'm not mistaken, it was first used in a poem, a Yiddish poem in the 1920s about the siege of, there was a mini-series about this in the 1970s, the siege of Masada, was it? Right, yes, Masada. I think that was the original use of the phrase. It was embraced by the prisoners who were liberated at Buchenwald in 1945. I wouldn't agree with you that the phrase is limited or should be limited to the destruction of the European Jews or Jews anywhere. I think I would like to hope that it has a wider meaning than that. I remember years ago I was listening to NPR I sound like a commercial now for raising money for NPR. But I was listening to a really interesting discussion at NPR, and it was with a Holocaust survivor and a young woman who had survived the genocide in Rwanda, and they went around the country in tandem and talked about their experiences. And I remember this one woman called up, and she said, this phrase "never again," the phrase "never again" has come to me. Never again will, in the middle of Europe, 6 million Jews be killed. And I would hope that the phrase has larger meaning than that. I think that most Germans, of course, think of their own past when they use that term, but I think it has a broader meaning beyond just attacks against and persecution and murder of the Jews. And I would just say one other thing in response to what you said with Helmut. It wasn't called Helmut Schmidt and Joschka Fischer and others. Those are examples I give, but the thrust of the book is more about the efforts of German politicians, as well as ordinary Germans, to do what they could to help those suffering in other lands. So if I gave you the impression that most were not interested in helping or doing anything, then I gave you the wrong impression, because that is not what I show in the book. Of course, there certainly were some, like Helmut Schmidt. He had bigger issues as Chancellor of Germany, but in his mind, but that is not the overall argument.
Thank you. You said that in Germany, even the right-wing groups accepted responsibility for what it had, and indicated in some form willingness, I won't use the word atone for it, but to make some adjustment. Yeah. And that we in the United States can learn from it. Yes, my big question is how? How do we influence our right-wing world to accept the responsibility for the injustices that were done historically here, and what to do about it?
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I could try to take the easy way out and say I'm not going to get involved in politics, but I left that that door open with my talk. So when I talk about the right wing taking responsibility in Germany, I'm not talking about the crazies, right? I'm not talking about the ones on the extreme right. I'm talking about mainstream Germans. mainstream conservative Germans. And it was one of the effects of the uproar of the late 1960s, when German society really started talking about what had happened during the Third Reich. Not so much the Holocaust, that begins a decade later in the late 70s, but talking about the Nazi period. Now, as far as our own country goes, and as far as conservatives here go, I'm gonna tread very carefully here. But I would say this. In response to the first question, you probably noticed how careful I was about emphasizing that I'm not collapsing distinctions, right? That I'm not saying 400 years of slavery and Jim Crow and all these other things that have happened to African Americans and other disadvantaged groups in this country are the same as or as bad, or that it was a Holocaust. You know, I'm not going there. But the very fact that I have to tread lightly and walk on eggshells when I respond to a question about reparations shows just how much I worry that that will be the reaction, right? That I'm somehow relativizing German crimes. Now, I think that if we lived in a place where where you didn't have backlash on the part of not the crazies, but mainstream conservatives against wanting to take down, say, Confederate monuments, where that's, I mean, could you imagine the uproar if there were reports in the United States that, you know, Germany wanted to, you know, keep statues of this one or that one. I just read on Twitter, yeah, I'm one of the few who's still on Twitter. I read on Twitter today, one of my colleagues was complaining because Hamburg is planning on building or refurbishing a monument to Kaiser Wilhelm. You know, Kaiser Wilhelm was not, he was no Adolf Hitler, he certainly was no Robert E. Lee, but I guess there's nothing, I don't see any shame in acknowledging past mistakes that your own country has made. The problem is, and I was guilty of this when I was much younger, is this sliding into the opposite direction, making everything out to be bad. Everything about the U.S. is wrong. I probably shouldn't admit this in public, but you know, when I was in 11th grade, I used to write a column for my high school newspaper, and in 1983 I wrote a piece defending the Soviets shooting down that Korean airline, asking what would the John Birch Society have done if it had, you know, if the shoe had been on the other foot. Okay, not something I would argue today, but that kind of black and white and going to extremes, if we could get beyond that and have a rational discussion about mistakes that were made here, and not saying that that makes everything about the United States horrible, I think we'd be in a much better place. I think it has to do with the tenor of debate, and the Germans needed a long time for that. You know, it's not as if German conservatives embraced their country's horrible past right away. You know, even in the early 50s, the chancellor at the time, Adenauer, when he agreed to reparations to Israel, he had to overcome the opposition of his own mainstream conservative party. What I'm saying is that today, after all the memory work that's been done there, conservatives there are also very open to discussing this. Again, the problem is when it becomes excessive. I don't know how to define that, but when it becomes excessive, you get a backlash. And in Germany, the backlash has not only been by the right, but also by progressives, people with impeccable progressive credentials. I mean, I'll mention names you probably haven't heard of, but Jörg Friedrich, who wrote this book about the bombing of German cities, which he referred to as a Holocaust. Michael Walzer, who is a leftist novelist who complained that the Holocaust is used as a moral cudgel. Günter Grass, who wrote a novel a few years ago called Crab Walk, which talks about the Gustloff, by the way, that ship that I mentioned before, that Neudeck and his family had almost taken. And he writes in this novel, at least that's what I took away from it, the dangers of not dealing openly with a country's past, not just what it did, but also its own suffering. My point being, there is a backlash that happens, and that's what we need to avoid. You know, we need to discuss these things, look them squarely in the face and say, look, we've made mistakes. It doesn't mean that everything is bad here. So I guess I listen to myself now and I think, well, it's kind of a lame response, but I think a more humane, respectful discourse and public exchange would go a long way in achieving what you would like to see. So, thank you.
All right, we have time for one more question.
I'd like to go back to the title again, Never Again, but I'll try to frame it with a much shorter question this time. And so when
I'll
you
try
talk
to answer
about,
more short.
when you talk about the countenance of the German society people and reparations and all that, but I wonder if you could just talk counterbalancing what you're just talking about in Germany, or is it being over portrayed by the American press?
Look, I mean, I think it's a good question. I think any time, images of neo-Nazis marching in the streets of Germany are of course, going to get a lot more press attention, not just in the United States, but also in Germany, than those Germans who go out holding candles for peace. And there are millions who do that as well. Is it a problem? Yes, there are some areas that are very, very bad. If you're dark-skinned, you just don't want to go there. Is what's happening in Germany any worse than what's happening in other places in Europe or in the United States? Recently, what was that in Florida? These neo-Nazis demonstrating in front of Disney World. Of course, it has a different quality in Germany because of its history. But maybe we need to reach a point in this country where people, and again, this is going, I think, in the direction of the question that this person before asked, how do we reach that consensus that this is just inexcusable, that neo-Nazis are protesting in this country and being defended by, being told there are good people on both sides. Again, I'm not, no political commentary, but that would be my answer to your question. Thank you for it.
Well, another round of applause for Dr. Andrew Port. Thank you all very much for coming this evening. I would like to invite everyone to a dessert reception in our hall immediately following. Also, Dr. Port will be in the classrooms next door signing copies of his book if you'd like to grab a copy and come and say hello. Also, please check our website for upcoming programming. In September, we have our program called The Suitcase, and in November 12th, we have our 39th annual anniversary benefit event downtown at Huntington Place. So thank you all again for coming and have a wonderful evening.